In this presentation, we will cover the paper Assessing the Role of Virtual Reality with Passive Haptics in Music Conductor Education, a pilot study. This paper presents a novel virtual reality system that offers immersive experiences for instrumental music conductor training. The system utilizes passive haptics that bring physical objects of interest, namely the baton and the music stand, within a virtual concert hall environment. Real-time object and finger tracking allow the users to behave naturally on a virtual stage without significant deviation from the typical performance routine of instrumental music conductors. The proposed system was tested in a pilot study that assessed the role of passive haptics in virtual reality by comparing our proposed smart baton with a traditional virtual reality controller. Our findings indicate that the use of passive haptics increases the perceived level of realism and that their virtual appearance affects the perception of their physical characteristics. The main goals of the proposed system are the following. Enhance the traditional training of novice instrumental music conductors by increasing their practice time without requiring additional space allocations or time commitment from music players, which is also cost-effective. Provide an interface for natural user interaction that does not deviate from the traditional environment of conducting, including the environment, the tools, and the user behavior, hand gesture, head pose, and body posture, thus making the acquired skills highly transferable to real-life scenario. Just-in-time feedback is essential in any educational setting. Therefore, one of the goals of the proposed system is to generate quantitative feedback on the timeliness of their body movement and their corresponding music signals. Last but not least, the proposed system recreates the conditions of a real stage performance, which may help the users reduce stage fright within a risk-free virtual environment. The use of computer systems in instrumental music conductor education has been a well-studied topic, even outside the area of virtual reality. Several systems have been proposed that offer targeted learning experiences, which may also combine gamified elements. In the past decades, several visual interfaces have been designed using the available technologies at each given period of time, which most recently included eye tracking and augmented and virtual reality platforms. As an example of these studies, I will show you a brief video from British Columbia School of Music. In this study, a virtual reality headset, including the controllers, the virtual reality controllers, has been used, so the students can use those controllers and move them naturally using hand gesture, natural gestures that replicate the actual movements of a baton. In the virtual reality stage, they can see a virtual 3D model of an actual baton that can track their movements and calculate significant values such as the beats per minute in order to track if the particular music signals are properly executed by the students within this virtual reality environment. Recent advances in real-time object tracking and their availability as consumer electronic devices have been further advanced this type of virtual reality experiences. One can hold physical objects instead of VR controllers, and research has been shown that this contributes to a sensory-rich experience. In our particular case, the users can hold and feel the main objects of interaction, such as tools, handles, and other instruments, musical instruments, or batons in our particular case. So what we are proposing in this particular study is to assess the system, the proposed system, and particularly the role of passive haptics in this virtual reality application. First of all, we want to test whether the use of passive haptics increases the perceived level of realism in comparison to a typical virtual reality controller. And second, we want to test whether the virtual appearance of a real physical object, such as the baton, affects the perception of its physical characteristics. So for this paper, a virtual environment, a virtual reality orchestra environment was developed by imitating the architectural design of the University of Florida auditorium. A large instrumental ensemble in a semicircle layout with 5 rows and 5 chairs was added to this environment. The system was developed in fall 2019, and the system allowed the user to interact with the virtual environment using a virtual reality headset and controllers. 2 additional Vive trackers were firmly attached to 2 real physical objects, a music stand and a wooden handle, in order to track their position and orientation. So one of these trackers, the one that was attached to the wooden handle, was called the Smart Baton. In this particular case, we created a hardware that had real-time with 6 degrees of freedom tracking, and the handle imitated the one of a real baton. Now, the use of passive haptics is evident in this particular device because the students could hold this in a similar way as a real baton. And in addition, this tracking enabled music signal recognition. In other words, we can tell exactly where the device is pointed to and what is the particular rhythm that it follows. So we can estimate in real time the beat per minute, and in comparison to the actual virtual reality controller, it is lighter, and actually the weight is just 64% of the original virtual reality controller. Now, another significant characteristic is there are no additional technological interfaces and buttons in this smart baton, which makes it very intuitive to use without any confusion of what exactly to do and how to utilize it within this environment. Let's now watch a short demo of the solution. This environment included not only the smart baton, but also a smart music stand that had also position tracking so that the user could reposition this stand and conveniently within the virtual orchestra environment. Now, we conducted a user study using the following 2 hypotheses. The use of passive haptics increases the perceived level of realism in a virtual reality application. And second, the virtual appearance of a real physical object affects the perception of its physical characteristics, such as weight and size. This user study was conducted at the University of Florida Reality Lab in spring 2020 and included 13 subjects. Now, all of these, both of these hypotheses were assessed using a set of A/B tests. The first set wanted to compare the different hardware using the same virtual reality appearance. In other words, the users experienced the same virtual environment and observed the same virtual baton, but they were holding first the typical virtual reality controller, and second, the proposed smart baton. In the second set of experiments, the users used the same hardware, our proposed smart baton, but with different virtual reality appearance. In other words, first, they were observing in the virtual space a 3D model that replicated a real baton. And in the second case, they observed a 3D model that was identical to the hardware that they are holding. All of these, in both of these tests, the users, at the end of the experiences, answered a questionnaire of these 8 questions. they had randomly the two experiences, the A and B experience, in a random order, and the questions addressed some of the particular qualities that we wanted to assess. For example, did the first or the second controller you held feel lighter? Or you held feel bulkier? Or more like a real baton, or more appropriate for this particular application? Now, we used a 7-scale response that was replicating the typical 7-scale response range from strongly agree to strongly disagree that was slightly modified to fit these particular A/B tests. So in other words, strongly agree with the first or strongly agree with the second particular experience in these A/B tests. Now, in the first round of tests, where the users used different controllers, but they observed the same virtual reality experience, we found that the proposed baton was identified as more real, lighter, less bulky, and more appropriate to this application, and easier to move in this virtual reality space. In the second round of experiments, where the users hold exactly the same hardware, the proposed hardware, but they were observing two different 3D models, we observed that the users felt that the virtual appearance that matches the real conductor's baton felt more real, actually felt less bulky, more appropriate for this application, more clear on how to operate, and that it is more possible to improve someone's skills. It is interesting that the users were holding exactly the same hardware. Nevertheless, they felt that one of them was more clear to operate than the other, and one felt bulkier than the other. In addition, one of them felt lighter than the other and more comfortable to use. Finally, an agglomerative hierarchical cluster tree was created by computing the linkage between the questions. In our case, we employed Cronbach's alpha as the measure of affinity, which indicates the internal consistency between the responses that a pair of questions received. According to this figure, questions 1 and 4 were linked together at consistency level 0.85 and were joined by question 3 at 0.75. Similarly, questions 6 and 7 were also linked together at 0.82 and joined by question 2 at 0.77 level. This indicates that the questions about how real and how appropriate are associated with less bulky, and the questions about how comfortable and easy to move are associated with lighter. It should be noted that the questions about easy to operate and improve skills were connected with weaker links to the rest of the clusters. The conclusions of this study are the following. The relation between the type of controller and perceived realism was found to be significant using chi-square test of statistical significance between those two variables. In addition, the Smart Baton felt more real compared to the HTC Vive controller, easier to move, and more appropriate for this application. Furthermore, the relation between the virtual appearance of a controller and its perceived physical characteristics was found also to be significant using, again, a chi-square test of statistical significance between those two variables. I would like to note that the same hardware controller was used in this type of test, and the only variable was its appearance in the virtual environment. Our findings set the basis for a larger scale future study that can be further developed in order to assess the educational aspects of this virtual reality application in terms of its learning outcomes. We would like, finally, to acknowledge the UF College of the Arts for providing funding for this research through the 2020 Research Incentive Award.